I am Joshua, 35 years old, and my own brother dragged me into a Texas courtroom to steal the fortune I spent my entire adult life building from the ground up. Before I tell you how a single, sealed manila envelope made the judge laugh right in his smug face and completely destroyed his master plan, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The courtroom in San Antonio was sweltering that morning, the kind of heavy, sticky heat that makes everyone irritable. The air smelled of cheap lemon floor wax, old paper, and the nervous sweat of the crowd. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder. Every wooden bench groaned under the weight of local reporters, nosy neighbors, and distant relatives who just wanted a front-row seat to a family tearing itself apart over money. I sat at the defendant's table, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. Next to me was my lawyer, Major Ellen Whitford. Ellen was technically retired from the military JAG Corps, but she still carried herself like she was walking into a war zone. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit, her hair pulled back tightly. She did not fidget. She did not glance back at the whispering crowd. She just stared straight ahead, organizing her legal pads with terrifying precision. Across the center aisle sat my older brother, Carter. He was 38 years old, but he was acting like a high school quarterback who had just thrown the winning touchdown. He wore a charcoal gray designer suit that probably cost more than the first car I ever owned. His hair was slicked back, his watch catching the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. He kept leaning over to whisper to his lawyer, a man named Pearson. Pearson looked like the kind of attorney who billed his clients by the syllable and loved the sound of his own voice. Carter leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and shot me a look. It was a smirk, the exact same arrogant, entitled smirk he used to give me when we were kids, right before he broke one of our father's tools and blamed it entirely on me. Pearson stood up, aggressively buttoning his suit jacket. He puffed out his chest, stepping out from behind his table to address Judge Marjorie Qley. The judge was a formidable woman in her late 60s. She had a reputation for chewing up unprepared lawyers and spitting them out before lunch recess. She peered down at Pearson over the rim of her reading glasses, her expression completely unreadable. "Your Honor," Pearson began, intentionally projecting his voice so the reporters sitting in the back row could catch every single dramatic syllable. "My client, Carter Baxter, is here today to claim what is rightfully his. We are officially demanding half of the defendant's fortune, including the entire trust and estate left behind by their late father, Colonel Thomas Baxter. 4 years, the defendant, Joshua Baxter, has unfairly and maliciously consolidated these family assets under his own name. He manipulated an elderly, grieving man in his final days, effectively cutting the rightful firstborn son out of his inheritance." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Camera shutters clicked frantically from the press row like a swarm of angry locusts. Carter nodded solemnly at the judge, putting on a tragic, deeply wounded face for his audience. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and actually dabbed the corner of his eye. I knew damn well there were no tears falling. It was a performance. He wanted half. He wanted half of the logistics consulting business I had built from absolutely nothing. He wanted half of the legacy I had sworn to protect. He truly believed he was entitled to the fruits of my grueling labor simply because we happened to share the same last name. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth started to ache. The sheer audacity of his lies made my blood boil under my collar. Ellen leaned over slightly, her voice a calm, low whisper that barely reached my ears over the murmurs of the crowd. "Let him put on his little daytime television show, Joshua. Noise is not evidence. We stick to the strategy." I took a deep, slow breath, letting the tension roll off my shoulders. I had spent 15 years as a logistics officer in the United States Army. I have managed multi-million-dollar supply chains in active hostile war zones. I have kept convoys moving while mortar shells shook the literal ground beneath my boots. A pampered, arrogant older brother throwing a legal tantrum in a Texas civil court was not going to break my composure. "Mr. Baxter," Judge Qley said, her sharp eyes shifting away from Pearson and locking directly onto me, "your brother's legal counsel has just made a very bold, Very serious claim regarding your father's estate. Do you have a response for this court? I stood up slowly. I did not raise my voice. I did not put on a dramatic show for the reporters desperately scribbling on their notepads. I simply reached down into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. I walked the few steps to the bailiff and handed it to him. He took it and passed it up to the high wooden bench. Your Honor, I said, keeping my voice dead calm and perfectly steady. I do not have a prepared speech today. I just have that envelope. I highly suggest you read it before we waste any more of this court's valuable time. Carter let out a loud, mocking scoff that echoed in the quiet room. Pearson rolled his eyes and shook his head condescendingly. But Judge Qley ignored them. She picked up a brass letter opener, broke the heavy wax seal, and pulled out a thick stack of official documents. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second. The entire room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Then, the corners of Judge Qley's mouth twitched. She looked up at Carter, looked back down at the paper, and let out a sharp, booming laugh. It was a genuine laugh of pure disbelief. Carter's smirk instantly vanished, his face draining of all color. Pearson frantically looked at his client, confusion washing over his face. Carter gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning stark white. The confident, wealthy persona he had walked in with was evaporating by the second. Is there something humorous about my client's pursuit of justice, Your Honor? Pearson asked, his voice losing its theatrical boom, replaced by a slight, nervous quiver. Judge Qley took off her glasses and placed them gently on the documents. She looked at Carter with an expression of absolute pity mixed with total disdain. Mr. Pearson, I am laughing because your client has dragged this court into a media circus over a door that was locked, deadbolt, and cemented shut a long time ago. The whispers in the gallery flared up again, louder this time. I sat back down next to Ellen, feeling the cold, hard wood of the chair against my spine. I didn't smile. There was no joy in this victory, just a heavy, profound sense of finality. To understand why a 38-year-old man dressed in a $5,000 suit suddenly looked like a terrified, cornered child who had just been caught stealing from the cookie jar, you cannot just look at this courtroom. You have to go back. You have to rewind 15 long, painful years. You have to go back to the exact day my family completely shattered, the day I packed my bags, and the day I finally realized that sharing blood with someone does not make them family. Loyalty does. Growing up inside the Baxter household meant learning very quickly how to survive the hierarchy. And my place in that hierarchy was dead last. Carter was 3 years older than me, and from the very moment I was old enough to understand human interactions, it was brutally clear that he was the designated golden child of the family. My mother treated him like absolute royalty. If Carter brought home a C on a high school math test, my mother would immediately call the school, insisting the teacher was simply too harsh or the curriculum was flawed. If I brought home a straight A report card, she would barely glance at the paper before handing it back and telling me to go take out the kitchen trash. My father, Thomas, was a decorated Gulf War veteran. He was a hard, quiet man who communicated mostly through grunts and strict orders. He preached discipline, hard work, and the absolute necessity of earning your keep in this world. He made me mow the lawns, chop the firewood in the brutal Texas heat, and fix the leaky plumbing under the sink. I desperately wanted his approval. I wanted him to look at me with the same fierce pride he showed when he talked to his old army buddies. But there was a massive, glaring blind spot in my father's rigid, military-style worldview. That blind spot was Carter. My father was fiercely strict with me, but whenever Carter messed up, broke a rule or caused a scene, Dad would just let out a heavy sigh and open his wallet. Carter never did chores. He never held a summer job. He just asked and he received. The ultimate breaking point, the moment that severed my emotional ties to that house forever, hit when I was 20 years old. I had been working at a local, rundown auto repair shop for 2 straight years. I busted my knuckles daily on greasy engines, coming home smelling like motor oil and cheap coffee. I was saving every single dollar I earned to buy a used Ford truck. I desperately needed that reliable truck to commute to a better-paying logistics job 2 towns over. I kept my cash stuffed inside a thick envelope hidden deep in my sock drawer. $2,000. It was everything I had in the world, representing hundreds of hours of manual labor. One humid Tuesday evening, I came home from a brutal 10-hour shift, my hands stained dark with grease. I walked into the kitchen and found my parents sitting quietly at the table. Carter was leaning casually against the kitchen counter, spinning a shiny new set of car keys around his index finger with a massive grin on his face. "Joshua, sit down for a minute," Dad said, his voice heavy and uncomfortable. "What is going on?" I asked, eyeing Carter's keys. My mother refused to make eye contact with me. She stared down at her coffee mug. "Your brother found a really great deal on a car today. A used Porsche. It is a classic model. It will really help him look professional for his upcoming corporate job interviews." "Okay," I said, feeling a cold, tight knot begin to twist violently in my stomach. Good for him. He needed a cash down payment to secure the vehicle, Dad said, staring a hole directly through the center of the wooden kitchen table. "We were short on cash this month. So, we went into your room and we took your envelope." I completely froze. The air left my lungs as if I had been punched in the chest. "You went into my room? You took my truck money? Without even asking me?" Carter laughed. A sharp, incredibly dismissive sound. "Relax, Josh. Don't be so dramatic. It is an investment in the family's image. I will pay you back with interest when I get my first big salary. Besides, you do not really need a truck right now. You just work at a dirty garage." I looked desperately at my father, waiting for him to step in, waiting for him to enforce that ironclad discipline and honor he always preached about. But Dad just looked away. He let it happen. He chose his favorite son over my hard work. I did not yell. I did not scream or throw plates against the wall. I just turned around, walked into my bedroom, grabbed a canvas duffel bag, and shoved my clothes inside. I walked out the front door into the warm Texas night and never moved back in. The very next week, I was standing inside a sterile military recruitment office, raising my right hand and swearing an oath to defend the United States Army. If I wanted to belong to a family that actually valued loyalty, structure, and hard work, I was going to have to find it wearing a uniform. For the next 15 years, I gave my blood, my sweat, and my youth to the military. I trained relentlessly. I became a logistics officer, learning how to move tons of heavy equipment, vital ammunition, and food supplies through incredibly hostile territory. The Army broke my old self down and rebuilt me into a man who simply did not tolerate excuses. I started my civilian consulting firm, Ironwood Strategies, while I was finishing my final years of active duty service. I saved my money carefully. I built my fortune the hard, honest way. While I was sleeping on uncomfortable cots in the desert and dodging sandstorms, Carter was systematically destroying his own life. He completely wrecked that precious Porsche within a year, wrapping it around a telephone pole. He bounced from job to job, always getting fired within months because he refused to show up on time or take orders from management. He got married to a woman he barely knew, went through a spectacular divorce, and then fought a bitter, incredibly expensive custody battle over their golden retriever. My parents paid every single cent of his lawyer fees. He maxed out multiple credit cards and burned absolutely every bridge he ever crossed. Every single time he failed, Mom and Dad were there to bail him out financially. Then, 2 years ago, the music finally stopped playing. Mom passed away from a sudden, massive stroke. Dad deteriorated fast after losing her. His health plummeted, and he was moved into an assisted living facility. When I got the dreaded call that Dad was in hospice care and his organs were shutting down, I immediately booked a flight back to Texas. Carter barely showed up to the hospital. He claimed he was too emotionally devastated, but I knew he was just busy dodging debt collectors who were calling his cell phone every hour. When Dad finally took his last, rattling breath, I honestly thought the worst chapter of my family's history was over. I had absolutely no idea the real war was just beginning. It rained violently the day we buried Dad. A cold, miserable, relentless Texas downpour that soaked right through the shoulders of my black suit. I stood silently by the edge of the open grave, watching the heavy wooden casket get lowered into the thick mud. A small handful of Dad's old army buddies showed up, standing at rigid attention in the back of the cemetery, ignoring the rain. Exactly 10 minutes after the memorial service started, a sleek, black Porsche Panamera pulled up aggressively onto the wet grass near the gravestones. Out stepped Carter. He was wearing dark, expensive sunglasses despite the heavy clouds, and he was holding a massive black golf umbrella. He walked slowly up to the grave, placed a single hand theatrically on the lid of the casket, and let out a loud, echoing sob. The few distant relatives in the crowd murmured in deep sympathy. I just watched him with cold detachment. I knew that Porsche was a rental car. I knew his bank accounts were overdrawn. And I knew exactly what he was doing an hour later when we all went back to the old family house for the reception. While I was in the kitchen quietly pouring coffee for the grieving guests, I heard a distinct, metallic scraping sound coming from Dad's old study down the hall. I walked down the corridor and pushed the heavy oak door open. Carter was on his knees on the rug, frantically twisting the combination dial on Dad's heavy iron floor safe. "Get away from that," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a whip. Carter jumped violently, bumping his head hard on the underside of the mahogany desk. He scrambled up to his feet, his face flushed bright red. "I'm just looking for his old medical records, Josh. Relax, take a breath. The medical records are filed at the hospital," I told him, stepping fully into the room and blocking the exit. "You are looking for cash, and let me save you the trouble. There isn't any." The very next morning, we sat across from each other in the stuffy, wood-paneled office of Dad's old civilian estate lawyer. Carter was practically vibrating in his leather chair with barely contained excitement. He kept tapping the toe of his expensive, polished shoes against the floorboard. He desperately needed a massive cash payout, and he needed it yesterday to get the creditors off his back. The elderly lawyer put on his thick reading glasses, cleared his throat, and opened a thick file folder. "Before we go through the standard physical assets of the house, I must inform both of you that the primary liquid assets, the investment properties, and the bulk of your father's estate have been officially frozen. They are now placed under the direct, exclusive management of Joshua Baxter, pending the final execution of a separate trust document." Carter instantly stopped tapping his foot. His head snapped toward the lawyer so fast I thought he might break his neck. "Wait, what? What do you mean they are frozen? Under his management? I am the oldest son. I am the firstborn. Those were your father's explicit, legally binding instructions, Carter," the lawyer said calmly, not looking up from the paperwork. Carter stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. "You did this. You manipulated him when he was sick and weak. You poisoned his mind against me to steal my inheritance." "I have not lived in that house in 15 years, Carter," I said, leaning back in my chair and refusing to break eye contact. "I did not manipulate anyone. He made his own choices. I am taking you to court," Carter screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, spit flying from his lips. "I will strip you down to your last dime. I want my half." He turned, stormed out of the office, and slammed the heavy door so hard the framed diplomas on the wall rattled. I honestly thought he was just throwing another one of his classic, dramatic tantrums. I assumed he would cool off in a few days. I was completely wrong. Pure desperation makes people incredibly dangerous. Carter quickly hired a sleazy, aggressive attack dog lawyer named Pearson. Within a week, a process server handed me a massive lawsuit right outside my office building. But Carter and Pearson did not stop at utilizing the legal system. They took the fight straight to the local press. I woke up early on a Tuesday morning to my cell phone vibrating off the nightstand. My executive assistant, Sarah, had sent me an urgent link to a prominent local news website. The bold headline made my stomach physically drop. decorated veteran accused of cutting struggling brother out of family fortune. Carter had given them an exclusive sit-down video interview. He played the role of the innocent victim perfectly. He looked straight into the camera and talked about how much he loved our dad, how he had struggled through a painful divorce, and how his cold, emotionally detached, military-trained brother had swooped in at the last minute and hoarded all the family money. By noon, local news crews were camped outside the glass doors of my office at Ironwood Strategies. Major corporate clients started calling my phone, asking nervously if my company was financially stable. Carter was actively trying to destroy the business I had built from scratch, attempting to ruin my professional reputation just to force me into a quiet cash settlement. That upcoming weekend, the doorbell to my house rang. I opened it to find Aunt Martha, my late mother's younger sister. She stood on my front porch holding a warm green bean casserole dish in her hands, looking deeply concerned and incredibly sympathetic. "Oh, Joshua, this whole ugly thing is just a terrible, terrible misunderstanding," she said softly, walking uninvited into my living room and setting the dish on the counter. "Your brother is just hurting right now. He is grieving. If you just give him a little bit of the money, maybe $500,000 just to clear his immediate debts, it would make all this media noise go away. We are family, Joshua. We have to stick together." I was walking toward the kitchen to offer her a cup of coffee when I noticed something very wrong. Her large leather purse was sitting on my coffee table, and the top zipper was pulled wide open. Tucked inside the side pocket, the bright red recording light of her smartphone was glowing steadily. She was secretly wearing a wire to record my answers for Carter's lawyer. My blood ran instantly cold. I walked over, picked up her heavy purse, zipped it firmly shut, and handed it directly to her. "Get out of my house, Martha. Get out right now. And if you ever step foot on my property again, I will have the police arrest you for criminal trespassing." She went completely pale. She grabbed her bag, her hands shaking, and practically ran to her car parked in my driveway. I locked the deadbolt and leaned heavily against the thick wooden door. They were coming at me from all sides. My own blood relatives were acting like enemy combatants. I realized right then that I could not just sit back and defend myself. I had to go on the offensive. The very next morning, I drove straight to Ellen Whitford's downtown law office. Ellen had spent years defending high-ranking soldiers in incredibly high-stakes military tribunals. A local civilian smear campaign orchestrated by a desperate brother did not intimidate her in the slightest. Her office looked like a military war room. Legal documents were pinned aggressively to large whiteboards, and thick case files were stacked 3 feet high on her mahogany desk. "They are playing dirty, Joshua," Ellen said, handing me a massive, heavy file folder. "So we are going to stop playing nice. I ran a deep, comprehensive financial background check on your brother. Look at this." I opened the folder and started reading. It was an absolute financial horror show. Carter did not just have normal consumer debt. He was well over $100,000 in the hole. Multiple credit cards were completely maxed out. There were default notices on high-interest personal loans from extremely shady lending companies. And worst of all, there were massive unpaid gambling markers from 3 different casinos in Las Vegas. That shiny Porsche he drove to the funeral? He was 4 months behind on his lease payments, and repo men were actively hunting the streets for the vehicle. "He is not fighting you for his fair share of the inheritance," Ellen said, tapping her pen sharply against the paper. "He is fighting for his actual life. If he does not get a massive cash payout from you, he is going to prison for fraud, or worse, the loan sharks will find him. That desperation is our leverage." But Carter still had one more dirty trick up his sleeve. The following evening, I turned on the local evening news broadcast in my living room. There, sitting in the studio guest chair, was Julian, my former business partner. I had fired Julian 2 years ago because I caught him actively skimming cash off the top of our company's employee salary pool to fund his own lavish, reckless lifestyle. Now he was sitting on television, wearing a nice suit, looking straight into the camera lens. Joshua Baxter is a cold, ruthless man. Julian lied smoothly on the television screen, his face a mask of fake sincerity. He does not care about loyalty or fairness. When I asked for a rightful promotion and a salary increase, he fired me without cause to keep the profits for himself. I am honestly not surprised he is doing this exact same thing to his own flesh and blood. He is completely obsessed with money, power, and ultimate control. I grabbed the TV remote and hit the power button. The screen went black, plunging the room into absolute silence. Carter had actually dug up my disgruntled, thieving ex-partner to assassinate my character on live television. I felt a heavy, exhausting weight press down on my chest. It felt exactly like standing in a reinforced bunker while enemy artillery rained down outside. My cell phone buzzed. It was Sarah, my loyal assistant. "Boss, I saw the broadcast. Do not worry about our clients. I have already drafted and sent out a company-wide memo detailing Julian's legal termination for gross financial misconduct, with all the legal receipts and audit reports attached. Ironwood Strategies stands entirely behind you." I let out a long, shaky breath. "Thanks, Sarah. You are an absolute lifesaver." Despite Sarah's help, the PR damage was getting worse. I needed a silver bullet to kill this narrative. I drove my truck across town to a small, modest ranch house in a quiet neighborhood. Sergeant Miller answered the door. He was a retired Army combat medic who had served side by side with my dad in the Gulf War. He was a tough man of few words, with tired eyes that had seen way too much death. "Come in, Josh," he grunted, pushing open the rusted screen door. We sat at his small kitchen table, the only sound the ticking of an old wall clock. "Sergeant Miller, I need your help. I need you to come to court and testify. I need you to tell the judge what Dad actually did in those final months of his life." Miller shook his head slowly, wrapping his scarred hands around a coffee mug. "Your dad was my brother in arms. I love Thomas, but family disputes, they are always messy, kid. I do not want to drag his good name through the mud in some public circus." I pulled out my smartphone and pulled up the news article where Carter and Julian had publicly called Dad a weak, manipulated, senile old fool who had lost his mind. I slid the phone silently across the table. Miller put on his wire-rimmed reading glasses. As he read the cruel words, I watched his jaw tighten. A thick, angry vein began to pulse on his forehead. He slowly, deliberately pushed the phone back to me. "Nobody disrespects the colonel like that," Miller said, his voice dropping a terrifying octave. "What time do you need me in that courtroom?" The night before the inheritance hearing, I found it completely impossible to sleep. I paced around my house, the silence feeling incredibly heavy. I finally walked into my bathroom and stood in front of the mirror, splashing freezing cold water on my face. I looked at the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes. I looked down at the faded white scars on my forearms from my time serving overseas. I had fought in literal bloody wars, but this legal battle somehow felt worse. Because this time, the enemy staring at me across the battlefield had my mother's eyes and my father's smile. I walked into my closet and carefully pulled out my dark gray, tailored suit. I set up the ironing board and pressed my shirts, falling back into the old, comforting military rhythms of preparation that always kept me grounded when panic tried to set in. Carter clearly thought this was just a PR game. He thought he could use the media to bully me into submission. He did not realize that the United States Army had spent 15 years teaching me exactly how to lay an ambush and wait patiently for the enemy to step into the kill zone. I packed my leather briefcase, taking the heavy manila envelope and sliding it right into the center compartment. Tomorrow, the childish games would end permanently. We are now back in the courtroom, right where the story began. Carter was sitting on the wooden witness stand, giving the absolute performance of a lifetime. He gripped the edges of the stand tightly, his voice trembling with perfectly practiced emotion. "I was the one who stayed behind to help," Carter lied smoothly, looking directly at the empty jury box, even though this was a bench trial decided solely by the judge. "When Joshua ran off to play soldier and abandon us, I stayed. I tried my hardest to keep the family business together. But my dad, his mind was slipping fast in those last few years. Joshua came back, used his military intimidation tactics, and forced my terrified father to sign everything over. I just want the college fund Dad explicitly promised my future kids. I just want fairness and justice. Pearson paced back and forth across the floor, nodding with deep, manufactured sympathy. No further questions, Your Honor. The injustice happening here today is absolutely glaring. Ellen stood up smoothly from our table. She did not pace. She did not raise her voice. She walked straight to the wooden podium, carrying a thick, menacing black binder. Mr. Baxter, Ellen said, her sharp voice cutting through the stuffy room like a surgical scalpel. You claim you are here today fighting bravely for your future children's college fund. But isn't it true that you are currently drowning in massive debt to 3 different high-end casinos in Las Vegas? Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to Pearson. I had some bad business investments recently. Investments? Ellen flipped a heavy page in her binder. I have right here a certified notice of default on a personal loan with a staggering 40% interest rate. And let's talk about that luxury Porsche you drove to your father's funeral. Isn't it true that the vehicle is currently flagged in the system for immediate repossession because you haven't made a single lease payment in 4 months? Pearson jumped up aggressively. Objection. Relevance. My client's current temporary financial struggles are exactly why he desperately needs his rightful, legal inheritance. Overruled. Judge Qley snapped instantly, glaring at the lawyer. Sit down immediately, Mr. Pearson. Continue your questioning, Major Whitford. You do not want fairness, Carter? Ellen said, her voice dripping with cold ice. You want a financial bailout to save yourself from prison. Carter was visibly sweating now. He wiped his damp forehead with the back of his trembling hand. My dad loved me. He was proud of me. He would have wanted me to have that money. Joshua stole the will and hid the real documents. That was the exact moment I stood up and handed the bailiff the sealed envelope. The one that made Judge Qley laugh. Your Honor, Ellen said clearly, what you are holding in your hands is not a standard, easily manipulated civilian will. Exactly 3 months before his tragic death, Colonel Thomas Baxter contacted the highest levels of the military JAG Corps. He formally requested a full, ironclad military trust be established. It is fully notarized, federally certified, and legally witnessed by 3 active and retired military officers, including Sergeant Miller, who is sitting right there in the gallery. Carter's panicked eyes darted to the back row, locking onto Miller, who stared back at him with a look of absolute, terrifying disgust. Judge Qley stopped her brief laughter and began reading the heavy document aloud for the court record. Let the official record show this is a fully certified military trust. Clause 4, Section B clearly states, any inheritance, property, or liquid assets designated within this trust are to remain the sole, uncontested property of my youngest son, Joshua Baxter. My oldest son, Carter Baxter, is expressly and permanently forbidden from accessing, claiming, or managing any portion of this estate under any circumstances. A loud gasp ripped through the gallery. The reporters started scribbling furiously, nearly tearing their paper. Furthermore, the judge continued, pulling a small piece of handwritten stationery from the very back of the envelope, the deceased attached a deeply personal addendum. I have failed my oldest son by spoiling him. I have ruined Carter with my leniency. I am giving everything to Joshua because he is the only one who truly understands the heavy weight of responsibility. Joshua, I order you to protect this legacy from your brother's endless greed. Carter's face completely contorted in sheer horror. The arrogant, wealthy mask he had worn for 38 years completely shattered into a million pieces. No! He screamed at the top of his lungs, slamming his fists down violently on the wooden witness stand. That is fake. It is a massive lie. He would never do that to me. I am the firstborn son. It belongs to me. Mr. Baxter, control yourself immediately, Judge Qley barked, leaning over the bench. He brainwashed him, Carter shrieked, pointing wildly and desperately at me, tears of pure rage finally falling down his face. Give me my money. Give me what is mine. Bang! Bang! Judge Qley slammed her heavy wooden gavel down with terrifying, bone-rattling force. Bailiff, if this man raises his voice one more time in my courtroom, put him in handcuffs and drag him to a holding cell for contempt of court. Carter instantly froze, his chest heaving violently, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking way too big for his rapidly shrinking, pathetic body. He slumped back heavily into the wooden chair, burying his face deep in his shaking hands. He was completely done. The golden child had finally hit a massive, reinforced concrete wall that Mommy and Daddy couldn't buy him a way out of. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please like the video and leave a comment below to let me know you've been with me. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The silence that followed the judge's gavel strike was absolute and deafening. You could only hear the sound of Carter's heavy, pathetic, ragged breathing echoing in the large room. Judge Qley adjusted her glasses calmly and looked down from the high wooden bench with absolute, unquestionable authority. This court has thoroughly reviewed the evidence presented today, Judge Qley announced, her voice echoing clearly and firmly across the room. The military trust established by Colonel Baxter is unequivocally valid, completely comprehensive, and entirely legally binding under federal law. It leaves absolutely zero room for outside interpretation. All assets, accounts, and properties designated under this trust belong solely to the defendant, Joshua Baxter. Mr. Pearson, your client's lawsuit is frivolous, factually unfounded, and deeply insulting to the memory of a highly decorated American veteran. Pearson was looking down at his expensive shoes, looking like he was trying to figure out how fast he could physically run out of the building without tripping. The case is officially dismissed with prejudice, the judge continued relentlessly. Furthermore, Carter Baxter is hereby ordered to pay all of the defendant's legal fees and court costs incurred during this circus. Your massive personal debts, Mr. Baxter, remain entirely your own problem. Court is adjourned. Bang! The gavel struck the wood block one final time. It sounded exactly like a sniper's gunshot ending a long, bloody war. I stood up slowly, buttoned my dark suit jacket, and reached over to shake Ellen's hand. Thank you for everything, Major, I said sincerely. Just doing my job, soldier. You held the line well, she smiled faintly, packing her files away with military efficiency. I walked out of the courtroom doors, pushing my way past the frantic reporters who were now aggressively shoving digital voice recorders and microphones in my face, begging desperately for a dramatic quote. I did not say a single word to them. I just kept my eyes forward and kept walking. As I reached the heavy oak double doors leading out to the main hallway, a hand suddenly grabbed my elbow. It was Aunt Martha. She had fresh, dramatic tears streaming down her heavily powdered face, her arms wide open, clearly ready to pull me into a massive, loving hug. Oh, Joshua, sweetie, I am so happy. I always knew in my heart you were telling the absolute truth. I told Carter over and over he shouldn't do this terrible thing. Let's go get a nice steak dinner, just the two of us, and celebrate your big victory. I took a large step back, easily dodging her fake embrace. I looked her dead in the eyes. I remembered the glowing red recording light sitting inside her purse in my living room. I remembered exactly how quickly she turned on me when she thought Carter was going to win the money. Do not ever touch me, Martha, I said, my voice incredibly low and highly dangerous. And do not ever call my phone again. You chose your side in this war. Now go live with the consequences of it. She gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace in shock as I turned my back on her and walked away down the marble corridor. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt incredibly clean. I had finally cut the toxic infection completely out of my life. By the time I reached my truck in the courthouse parking lot, the vicious news cycle was already flipping on its head. My smartphone buzzed wildly with a news alert. The exact same local news website that had dragged my name through the mud all week had just published a massive new breaking story. Grifter brothers plot exposed. Decorated veteran vindicated in court over father's military trust. The court of public opinion is an incredibly fickle, ruthless beast. The journalists who had enthusiastically painted Carter as a tragic, weeping victim were now tearing him to absolute shreds online. They published exposed details of his massive gambling debts, his humiliating failed divorce, and his desperate, pathetic attempt to rob his own blood family. Julian, my traitorous, thieving ex-partner, released a public, groveling apology statement on Twitter within an hour of the verdict, claiming he had been severely misled by Carter's lies. I didn't care about his apology. The absolute truth was finally out there, stamped permanently into the public record for everyone to see. Carter couldn't hide behind mom's apron strings or dad's thick wallet ever again. He was finally exposed to the harsh light of reality. I drove the long way home as the hot Texas sun finally began to set, painting the massive sky in deep, beautiful shades of orange, purple, and red. When I unlocked the door and walked into my empty, quiet house, I didn't feel lonely at all. For the very first time in my entire 35 years of existence, the heavy, suffocating, dark shadow of my family's toxic expectations was completely gone. The ghost of the golden child was dead. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a generous glass of expensive bourbon, sat down heavily on my leather couch, and drank it in complete, beautiful, uninterrupted silence. That night, I slept for 10 straight hours. There were no nightmares about the war. There was no stress about lawyers. There was just absolute peace. But the universe has a very funny, very brutal way of permanently balancing the scales of justice. If you thought crying in the courtroom was rock bottom for Carter, you have absolutely no idea how fast and how hard a grown man can fall when the financial safety net is finally, permanently pulled away from him. Just 6 months later, the brutal consequences of his lifelong actions caught up to him in the most public, humiliating way imaginable. And my life? It was about to change in a profound way I never saw coming. 6 months passed since the gavel fell in Judge Qley's courtroom. Half a year of absolute silence from the people who shared my last name. No angry phone calls. No desperate text messages. No more surprise visits from relatives wearing hidden recording devices. I spent the scorching Texas summer focusing entirely on my business and rebuilding my own mental peace. But the universe has a very strict accounting system. You cannot spend decades living wildly beyond your means, manipulating your parents, and treating people like garbage without eventually receiving the bill. And for my older brother Carter, the bill finally came due in the middle of a crowded grocery store parking lot on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I did not have to go looking for the details of Carter's ultimate downfall. In a city like San Antonio, word travels fast, especially when a public spectacle is involved. I heard the entire pathetic story from an old high school acquaintance who happened to be loading his groceries 2 spots down from where the disaster unfolded. Carter had apparently strutted into a high-end organic supermarket wearing his usual designer clothes, acting like he still owned the world. He filled his cart with expensive steaks, imported wines, and artisan cheeses. But when he reached the checkout lane and swiped his platinum credit card, the machine beeped a harsh, loud rejection. Declined. He scoffed, cursed the cashier for a faulty machine, and aggressively swiped a second card. Declined. Then a third. Declined. His bank accounts were completely frozen, drained dry by the aggressive debt collectors who had finally secured legal judgments against him after our trial. Carter abandoned the full grocery cart right at the register, his face burning bright red, and stormed out through the sliding glass doors into the blistering Texas heat. He marched straight toward his pristine, black Porsche Panamera, the very same luxury vehicle he had shamelessly parked on the grass at our father's funeral. But he never got to open the door. A massive, heavy-duty tow truck was already backed up to the bumper. A large, heavily tattooed repo man named Dylan was rapidly securing thick steel chains around the rear axle of the Porsche. Carter absolutely lost his mind. He sprinted across the asphalt, screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded Dylan unhook the car immediately. He threatened to call the police. He threatened to sue the towing company into the ground. He screamed that his high-powered lawyer was going to destroy Dylan's life. Dylan did not flinch. He did not yell back. He calmly finished tightening the winch, wiped the grease off his hands with a dirty rag, and pulled a folded piece of official paperwork from his heavy canvas work jacket. He shoved the repossession order directly into Carter's chest. Dylan looked Carter dead in the eye and told him the car was 4 months delinquent. The bank owned it, and if Carter touched the tow truck, he would personally lay him out on the pavement. Carter froze. The arrogant bravado instantly melted away. He stood there in the baking sun, completely humiliated, surrounded by dozens of staring shoppers holding their cell phone cameras up, as he watched his ultimate status symbol get dragged away down the busy highway. That parking lot incident was just the first domino to fall. Within 30 days, the bank officially foreclosed on his luxury downtown condominium. The locks were changed, and his expensive, unpaid furniture was dragged out to the curb. Desperate, Carter started calling everyone he knew. He called his old drinking buddies. He called his ex-wife, demanding money from the child custody settlement they had fought over years ago. He even called Julian, the treacherous ex-business partner who had lied about me on television. Every single one of them blocked his phone number. The people who surround you when you are throwing around stolen cash evaporate the second the well runs dry. With his credit score completely obliterated and his reputation ruined by the media fallout from our trial, Carter ended up renting a single, roach-infested room in a weekly motel on the absolute worst edge of town. The golden child had finally hit rock bottom, and there was no wealthy father left to write a check and save him. While Carter was watching his artificial life collapse into dust, my life was expanding in ways I never could have predicted. The massive, negative media storm that Carter and his lawyer had tried to use as a weapon against me ended up becoming the greatest marketing campaign Ironwood Strategies ever had. In the corporate logistics world, trust is the only currency that actually matters. When major CEOs and supply chain directors watched the news and saw exactly how I handled the vicious, public attack from my own family, they paid very close attention. They saw a man who did not panic under immense pressure. They saw a veteran who kept his records immaculate, who refused to settle with extortionists, and who stood his ground with absolute discipline. You want a guy like that managing your international shipping routes and multimillion-dollar contracts. By the end of the fourth quarter, Ironwood Strategies had doubled its gross revenue. We signed 3 massive, long-term contracts with regional manufacturing hubs. My office was constantly buzzing with energy. One crisp Monday morning, I called my executive assistant, Sarah, into my office. Sarah had stood by me when the news vans were camped on our lawn. She had fielded the angry phone calls and managed the corporate damage control flawlessly. I handed her a thick manila folder. It was not a lawsuit this time. It was a completely restructured employment contract. I gave Sarah a massive, life-changing promotion to Chief Operating Officer, along with a salary increase that made her drop her coffee cup on my carpet. Loyalty in the trenches deserves to be rewarded on the mountaintop. Walking through the glass doors of my company every day filled me with an incredible sense of pride. I had built a fortress that greed could not breach. But despite the booming business, there was still a heavy weight sitting quietly in the back of my mind. The inheritance. The massive military trust that my father had left entirely in my name. I kept it sitting in a separate, high-yield holding account. I did not touch a single penny of it for my own personal lifestyle. I already had my own money. I didn't need Dad's cash to buy a bigger house or a flashy sports car. That money represented a lifetime of sweat, sacrifice, and ultimately, a father's desperate, dying wish to protect his family's honor from the vultures. I knew I had to do something profoundly meaningful with it. I called Major Ellen Whitford, my brilliant attorney. We spent weeks drafting complex legal frameworks, filing federal tax exemptions, and securing nonprofit status. Using a significant portion of the inheritance, I officially launched the Baxter Foundation. The core mission of the Baxter Foundation was simple but aggressively necessary. We provided completely free, top-tier legal representation and comprehensive financial estate planning to the families of military veterans. I knew firsthand that too many aging soldiers were targeted by predatory relatives. Too many greedy children swooped in during the final years of a veteran's life, manipulating their dementia or physical weakness to drain their life savings. I wanted to build a bulletproof legal shield for those families. We hired civilian lawyers, partnered with retired JAG officers, and set up free clinics to help veterans draft ironclad wills, secure their pensions, and establish rock-solid trusts so their grandchildren's college fund wouldn't be stolen by a selfish uncle with a gambling problem. I was taking the exact legal weapon my father used to save me, and I was handing it out to every vulnerable veteran in the state of Texas. We officially launched the Baxter Foundation on a chilly November morning, just a week before Thanksgiving. We didn't rent out a fancy hotel ballroom. We didn't invite the local press or hire a public relations firm to take glamorous photos. We held the launch in the main hall of the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. The air smelled strongly of old wood, floor wax, and massive urns of black coffee. The room was packed with the people who actually mattered. Real people. Sergeant Miller arrived early, wearing his pristine dress uniform, his chest heavy with perfectly polished medals. He walked straight up to me, gripped my hand with his scarred, calloused fingers, and pulled me into a tight embrace. He stepped back, looked me dead in the eyes, and told me the colonel would be incredibly proud of the man standing in front of him. Coming from a man who rarely spoke more than 3 words at a time, that compliment hit me harder than any medal I had ever received in the Army. During the event, I sat down at a folding table across from a young woman. She was the widow of a soldier who had served 2 tours overseas. Her husband's estranged family was currently dragging her through a vicious court battle, trying to force the sale of her modest home to claim a piece of his life insurance payout. She was exhausted, terrified, and completely out of money to pay her mounting attorney fees. I slid a signed contract across the table toward her. I looked her in the eyes and promised her that the Baxter Foundation was taking over her entire case immediately, free of charge, and we were sending our best attack dog lawyers to rip her greedy in-laws to shreds in court. The look of absolute, crushing relief that washed over her face, the heavy tears that fell onto the cheap plastic tablecloth, told me everything I needed to know. This was exactly what the money was meant for. This was the true inheritance. A few days after the foundation launch, I was sitting alone in my new, expanded corner office at Ironwood Strategies. The building was quiet. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across my mahogany desk. I opened my bottom drawer and pulled out a heavy, silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of my father, Colonel Thomas Baxter, taken right after he returned from Desert Storm. He looked so young, so fiercely rigid, his jaw set in that familiar, uncompromising line. For years, I had harbored a deep, quiet resentment toward that man. I resented him for making me chop wood while Carter slept in. I resented him for stealing my hard-earned truck money to fund my brother's reckless vanity. But looking at that photograph now, holding the heavy weight of the foundation's success in my heart, my perspective radically shifted. My father was an imperfect man. He made terrible, enabling mistakes with his firstborn son. He allowed Carter's messy divorce, the endless financial bailouts, and the toxic custody fights to slowly bleed him dry for decades. He was blinded by a father's desperate hope that the golden child would eventually grow up. But in the end, when the shadows were closing in and he knew his time on Earth was running out, the old soldier finally woke up. He saw the cold, undeniable truth. He realized he had created a monster, and in his final, ultimate act of command, he used the last ounce of his strength to protect the son who had actually earned his respect. He didn't just leave me money. He gave me a massive responsibility. The strictness, the chores, the refusal to bail me out when I was a kid, those weren't punishments. They were basic training. He broke my entitlement early so I could survive the real world, while he accidentally softened Carter into absolute uselessness. I finally understood the complicated, flawed love of Thomas Baxter. I placed the silver frame carefully on the corner of my desk, right where I could see it every single day. People frequently ask me if I ever talk to Carter anymore. They ask if I plan to reach out, if I will ever offer him a small job at my company, or if I will throw him a financial lifeline now that he is living in a miserable, squalid motel. Society loves a heartwarming story of family reconciliation. We are conditioned to believe that blood requires endless forgiveness, no matter how toxic the relationship becomes. The answer is no. Absolutely, unequivocally no. Aunt Martha tried to send me a long, dramatic email around Christmas, telling me that Carter was highly depressed and struggling to afford basic groceries. She heavily implied that I was being cruel by enjoying my success while my own flesh and blood suffered in poverty. I deleted the email without typing a single word in reply. I do not hate Carter. I do not spend my days wishing him active harm. But I refuse to absorb the consequences of his disastrous choices. Letting someone hit absolute rock bottom, letting them feel the brutal, unfiltered pain of their own laziness and entitlement, is the only way they will ever change. If I sent him a check today, I would just be funding his next illusion. True peace does not come from fixing toxic people. True peace comes from firmly locking the door and letting them figure out how to survive in the storm they created. Carter is finally experiencing the real world, the world where nobody cares about your excuses, and you actually have to work to eat. It is the exact same world I stepped into when I walked out of that house at 20 years old with nothing but a duffel bag. He is just 18 years late to the lesson. I am sharing this deeply personal, incredibly painful chapter of my life with you because I know I am not the only one fighting this battle. I look at the analytics on these videos. I know exactly who is listening to my voice right now. Most of you are hardworking Americans over the age of 45. Many of you are in your 60s, entering your retirement years, looking back at the incredible lives and assets you have built through decades of exhausting labor, sacrifice, and endless stress. Listen to me very carefully. Do not let the heavy, manipulative guilt of the word family destroy the legacy you bled to create. Love does not mean acting as a permanent ATM for a child or a sibling who refuses to take basic responsibility for their own life. If you have a child who is grinding away, building a career, and acting with honor, do not punish them by dividing your assets equally with a sibling who is lazy, reckless, and toxic. Equal is not always fair. Protect your assets. Go to a ruthless lawyer. Draft an ironclad trust. Lock down your legacy so tightly that the greedy vultures in your family tree cannot steal a single dime when you are gone. Reward the discipline. Starve the entitlement. Here is the greatest lesson I pulled from the smoldering ashes of my family's total collapse. You cannot buy character, and you cannot inherit integrity. You have to forge those traits in the brutal fires of personal responsibility. My brother thought he could manipulate the law and use cheap tears to steal the fortune I built in the dirt. But the truth is a heavy, indestructible object, and when it finally dropped in that courtroom, it crushed his entire fabricated reality. You have the absolute right to set permanent, unbreakable boundaries with the people who share your blood. Removing a toxic, draining person from your life is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You owe your future to the people who respect you, not the people who exploit you. I want to know if my journey resonated with your own life experiences. What is the most powerful perspective you are taking away from this story? Drop down into the comments right now and share the lesson that hit you the hardest. Or, if you simply agree that setting hard boundaries and protecting your hard-earned legacy is the absolute right thing to do, just type the word "good" in the comments. Your engagement tells me that sharing these painful scars is truly worth the effort. Thank you for walking through this massive storm with me to the very end. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.